When the young men of Britain first answered the call to serve in the Great War, their hearts were filled with visions of glory, triumph, and honor. The posters spoke of adventure, of defending the homeland, of fighting for king and country. Streets were alive with parades, families waved flags, and the spirit of optimism seemed unbreakable. They believed it would be a few months of battle before victory was secured. They believed the war would make heroes of them. But when these same men stepped into the cold, waterlogged trenches, surrounded by mud, rats, and death, they learned a truth that no recruiter could ever tell them. Real courage is not the loud beating of drums, but the quiet decision to stand firm when everything within you wants to fall. In the darkness of those trenches, optimism died a slow death. The songs of glory faded under the thunder of artillery. The promise of a quick war turned into endless nights of terror and waiting. And yet, from that hell on earth, something far greater than blind optimism, was born the awakening of true courage. You see, the trenches stripped away illusion. They forced every man to confront his own fear, his own fragility, and his own faith. When you live each day not knowing if you'll see the next sunrise, you begin to understand what strength truly means. It is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of it. It is the refusal to surrender the human spirit, even when surrounded by despair. Those young volunteers who once dreamed of medals and victory came face to face with a different kind of heroism, one that doesn't shine, one that doesn't cheer. It's the heroism of endurance, the kind that wakes up in freezing mud, with boots soaked and heart heavy, and still stands guard. The kind that watches friends fall beside you, and still finds the will to hold the line. That kind of courage cannot be taught in books. It is born only through pain and persistence. The trenches, as cruel as they were, became the furnace that forged unbreakable men. When the bombs fell and the world seemed to crumble around them, these soldiers learned that the greatest battles are fought, not on open fields, but within the human soul. Every night in those trenches was a test of belief in survival, belief in purpose, belief that somehow all this suffering meant something. Optimism might have died, but conviction was born. They no longer fought for the fantasy of glory. They fought for the man beside them, for the brotherhood that only hardship could create. That was where courage transformed from emotion to principle. There is something profoundly powerful about the human mind when it reaches the point of breaking and yet chooses not to. When everything external collapses, when hope seems impossible, the inner strength that remains becomes almost divine. That is what the trenches revealed, that the human spirit, even crushed under fear and fatigue, can still rise. Those men began to understand that courage isn't about charging forward without fear. It's about walking forward in spite of it. This transformation mirrors life itself. Every one of us begins our own battles with optimism. We start projects, dreams, and relationships with enthusiasm and hope. But life, like war, is not always kind. It throws mud, storms, and setbacks our way, and it is in those moments, when optimism fades, that true courage must take its place. The same lesson those soldiers learned a century ago applies today's strength is not in the good times, but in the endurance of the bad ones. The trenches may have destroyed their illusions, but they also revealed the deepest truth of all, that even in the darkest conditions, a person can still choose light. The British volunteers entered the war as boys dreaming of honor. They returned as men who had discovered endurance. Their courage was no longer fueled by applause or patriotism, but by inner fire, a quiet strength born of surviving the impossible. Many could not put their experience into words, because it was not something to be told, only lived. The trenches had taken their innocence, but replaced it with wisdom, the understanding that courage is not a feeling that comes and goes. It is a choice renewed every single day. Imagine standing in knee-deep water, freezing, while shells explode above your head, while your comrades vanish in an instant, while the sky rains death, and yet you do not run. You hold your post, you breathe, you endure. You hope not for victory, but for the chance to live one more day. That is not blind optimism. That is the courage of a soul awakened. Those men did not conquer the enemy alone. They conquered their own weakness. This story, though born from the horror of war, carries an immortal lesson. When you face your own trenches, whether they are the trials of failure, heartbreak, poverty, or loss, remember that optimism will not always be enough. There will be days when belief feels like a lie. But in those moments you must not quit. You must hold your ground, as those soldiers did, with nothing left but willpower, for it is in those very moments that life refines you, toughens you, strengthens you, and transforms you from a dreamer into a doer, from a believer into a conqueror. The trenches were not just physical battlefields. They were mirrors showing men who they really were. And that is what every great struggle in life does. It reveals you to yourself. It removes the decorations and pretenses and asks, will you still fight when no one is watching? Will you still stand when all seems lost? The men who survived answered yes, not with words, but with action. The optimism of Britain's WW1 volunteers may have died in the mud, but from that death rose something everlasting, courage rooted not in illusion, but in truth. It was the courage of men who had seen horror and yet believed in life. The kind of courage that built nations, inspired generations, and taught the world that even when dreams die, the spirit must live on. So when life feels like a trench, remember them. Remember that true strength is not found in comfort but in struggle. Remember that courage is not the absence of pain, but the will to move through it. The young soldiers of Britain went to war with songs of victory. They returned with silence, but in that silence was the sound of endurance, the echo of souls that refused to be broken. That is how optimism died and how courage was born forever. Trench warfare was a crucible that burned away illusion and left only raw will. In the beginning, Britain's volunteers marched off to war with shining eyes and heads full of stories of swift battles, gallant victories, and a hero's welcome home. They carried flags and laughter, singing songs that promised glory. But when they reached the trenches, when the mud swallowed their boots, and the stench of death became their daily companion, they realized the war they imagined was nothing like the one they were fighting. The optimism that had fueled their march began to fade, replaced by a grim determination to simply survive. And yet, in that dying of false hope, something far more powerful was born, the unbreakable mind. Every man who stepped into the trenches faced not only the enemy, but also his own thoughts. There were no comforts, no certainties, no guarantees. Each day was a gamble with death. The constant roar of shells, the cries of the wounded, the endless rain and rats, it was a world designed to crush the human spirit. But the ones who endured discovered a secret power. Pain can be transformed into strength. Suffering, if it does not destroy you, becomes your greatest weapon. In that endless torment, these soldiers learned to command their minds, to rise above fear and despair, to create hope where none existed. The human mind, when tested beyond its limits, becomes something extraordinary. The trenches were not only battlefields, they were classrooms of the soul. Every explosion taught a lesson. Every fallen comrade was a reminder that life is fragile and that wasting it on weakness is a sin. The men learned to discipline their thoughts as much as their actions. They learned that courage was not a burst of emotion, but a decision repeated thousands of times, a decision to keep going. And that is the essence of power, the ability to move forward when every cell in your body screams to stop. Those volunteers entered the war as boys believing in the romance of battle, but the trenches stripped them of every illusion. They stopped dreaming of medals and parades. They began fighting for the man beside them, for survival, for dignity, and through that transformation they discovered the depth of human endurance. They found that the mind, once trained by hardship, becomes invincible. You can take away comfort, safety, and even hope, but you cannot break a man who has learned to master himself. This is the same truth that applies to every great struggle in life. Whether you are facing failure, loss, or rejection, the principle remains the same. You will be tested beyond what you think you can bear. Your optimism will be shattered, your plans will fall apart, and the easy path will vanish. But if you do not surrender, if you use pain as fuel instead of letting it drown you, you will grow into something unrecognizable, stronger, calmer, wiser. Pain will cease to be your enemy. It will become your teacher. The same way the soldiers in those trenches became hardened, you too can become unshakable. Napoleon Hill wrote that every adversity carries within it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. The trenches were filled with death, yet they birthed an army of minds that understood this truth. The soldiers who endured did not come back as the same men. They came back with eyes that had seen the worst and still found reason to live. They discovered that the measure of a man is not how loudly he celebrates in victory, but how quietly he endures defeat. The trenches broke their optimism, but revealed their strength, and that strength outlived the war itself. Think about it. How many people today crumble under small challenges because they have never faced anything real? The soldiers faced storms of steel, and yet they stood firm. Their will became their weapon. You too have trenches in your life days when nothing goes right, when every effort feels wasted, when the world seems indifferent to your pain. It is in those moments that you must remember the lesson of the trenches. Stand your ground, endure, let the pain carve strength into you, because on the other side of suffering is mastery. True power is not physical, it is mental. It is the calm that comes from knowing you can endure anything. That is what those men learned as they crouched in the mud, waiting for the next dawn attack. Their bodies trembled, but their minds sharpened. They stopped asking, "Why me?" and started saying, "I will survive." That shift from complaint to command is what separates the broken from the unbreakable. It is what turns ordinary men into warriors, ordinary lives into legacies. When optimism dies, something remarkable happens if you are willing to endure. Clarity appears. The illusions are gone. The noise is silenced, and what remains is truth, that you are stronger than you believed. The British volunteers who endured trench warfare found a purpose far beyond patriotism. They learned that the mind, once awakened through pain, becomes a fortress. It no longer depends on comfort or encouragement. It moves by will alone, and this is the message for every soul facing hardship. Do not mourn when your optimism fades. That fading is the fire refining you. Let the struggle harden your resolve, not your heart. Let it burn away weakness until only strength remains. The men of the trenches did not win every battle, but they won something greater: control over themselves. They became living proof that pain, transformed through discipline, produces greatness. So when you find yourself in your own trench, when life feels dark and endless, remember them. Remember that their victory was not in avoiding pain, but in using it. They turned fear into focus, loss into purpose, and suffering into strength. That is how pain becomes power, when it teaches you to rise not because the world is easy, but because you refuse to be defeated. And when you emerge from your trench as they did, you will not be the same. You will carry within you the quiet, unstoppable force of an unbreakable mind, the kind that can face anything, endure everything, and still stand tall. The trenches of the First World War were not just a battlefield of nations. They were a battlefield of the human soul. When Britain's volunteers first stepped into that war, they carried within them a fire of optimism. They were told it would be over by Christmas. that they would march through Europe like heroes, that the fight for king and country would be glorious and brief. But soon the guns roared louder than the drums of glory. The mud swallowed their dreams, the sky turned grey with smoke, and the songs of victory were drowned beneath the cries of the wounded. In that long silence between bombardments, something deep within them changed. The naive optimism that had filled their hearts began to die, but in its place was born something far greater, resilience. Resilience is not born in comfort. It does not grow in parades or patriotism. It is born in the cold, in the dark, in the moments when a man realizes that no one is coming to save him, and he must stand anyway. Those young soldiers learned this truth with every passing day. When the first shells fell, they ducked in fear, but when the 1,000th came, they no longer flinched. They learned that fear loses its grip when you face it again and again. The trench became their world, a world without luxury, without certainty, and without rest. Yet even there, in the filth and fire, they found a rhythm, a strange kind of strength that came from enduring what was meant to break them. At first, they fought for victory. Later, they fought simply to endure. And that endurance became their greatest victory. The death of their optimism was not the death of their spirit. It was its awakening. When the illusions of an easy life or a glorious battle vanished, the men learned the deepest truth of all. Life is struggle, and meaning is found in persistence. The soldiers who survived did so not because they avoided suffering, but because they embraced it as part of their journey. They learned that resilience is not resistance to pain. It is the decision to move forward despite it. The death of naivety is painful. It feels like betrayal, like the world has stolen something pure from you, but it is necessary for transformation. Those who entered the trenches as dreamers emerged as men who understood reality. They saw the cost of courage, the weight of sacrifice, and the truth of endurance. Optimism can make a man hopeful, but resilience makes him unbreakable, and in every generation it is resilience, not optimism, that rebuilds nations, restores faith, and rekindles purpose after the storm. When you look at those soldiers, you are not seeing men who lost their hope. You are seeing men who redefined it. Their hope was no longer based on promises of victory or parades. It became something deeper, a quiet belief that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would come. They didn't need to see the light to keep walking toward it. They became living proof that the human spirit can survive anything if it refuses to surrender. This lesson belongs to all of us. Life, in its own way, is a battlefield. We all begin with optimism, dreams of success, love, and peace. But life tests those dreams. It buries us under its mud and rain, challenges us with loss and disappointment, and waits to see whether we will give up. The moment your optimism dies, you stand at a crossroads. You can either give in to despair or let resilience rise in its place. That is your trench moment, the place where your illusions die, but your true strength is born. The British volunteers learned that heroes are not those who charge without fear. They are those who keep marching after fear has drained them. They discovered that bravery is not loud. It's silent, steady, and stubborn. It's the will to carry on one more day, even when you no longer believe in easy victories. That kind of resilience is the foundation of every triumph. The great builder, the entrepreneur, the survivor, all have walked through their own trenches. They have lost illusions, they have faced defeat, and yet they kept going. That persistence is the modern echo of what those soldiers lived a century ago. When optimism dies, a deeper kind of faith can take root, the faith in your own endurance. It is not blind, it is built through experience. It whispers, "I've been here before, I can survive this too." That is resilience, and that is how human progress happens, not through fantasy, but through the unshakable will of those who refuse to quit. Imagine standing in the cold mud, surrounded by endless death and fear, and still finding the courage to look toward tomorrow. That was the strength those men carried. It wasn't the optimism of dreamers, it was the faith of survivors. They had seen too much to be naive, but they had also grown too strong to be hopeless. And that is the kind of strength life demands from all of us, the strength to keep moving when the dream has fallen apart, when the plan has failed, when the light seems gone. Because the truth is, light never truly disappears. It just waits for those brave enough to walk through the dark to find it again. The trenches killed optimism, yes, but they gave birth to a generation that understood endurance. They returned home not with songs, but with wisdom. They taught the world that progress is not about avoiding hardship, it's about transforming it. They showed that even when the outer world collapses, the inner world can still stand tall. That lesson has outlived the war itself. So when life buries you in your own trenches, when dreams die, when faith fades, when the world seems against you, remember them. Remember that what seems like the death of hope is often the birth of resilience. Remember that optimism might inspire you, but resilience will save you. The men of the trenches became the living proof of an eternal truth, that from the darkest soil the strongest souls are grown, and that when you emerge from your own darkness, you will not be the same. You will be stronger, deeper, and more unshakable than you ever imagined.